Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Columbia Memorial Space Center today. Very glad to have you here with us up on our second floor. I'm in orbit. I'm just kidding, actually, right now. Very nice view of the Sinai Peninsula behind me here. But this is just us up here on the second floor having a pretty good day today. And I hope you're having a great Friday and hopefully going to have a great start to your weekend coming up here very shortly. So today, pretty exciting. Space Center Live, I got to say, I was pretty excited to talk about this. This is a subject that has been very relevant this week because of all of the celebrations that have been happening, very warranted celebrations because we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of the first human flight into space, which is Vostok 1 by Yuri Gagarin back on April 12th, 1961. And in addition to that, we also have the first flight of a space shuttle ever, STS-1 by Space Shuttle Columbia, with Commander John Young and pilot Robert Crippen going up on April 12th, 1981. Just a bunch of coincidences that they actually ended up flying 20 years apart to the day. We're going to go over a little bit today. Of course, just want to let you know that if you are watching live, which is the whole point of Space Center Live, you are more than welcome to ask us questions today in our live chat. I'm running solo today as my own producer, so I'm going to try as best I can to get all of your questions. I've got, like you see, I got a ton of computers around me right now, kind of with the usual setup that we have. And I get the extra producer computer today, so this is pretty impressive. I got to say, it's like a small mission control around me at the moment. We'll try to get to your questions if you have them. And of course, if I don't know, I'll just say I don't know. That's the way it works around here with all of your things. So why talk about it when, or why should I keep talking about it when we can actually go to the thing itself? So let's go ahead and get our presentation started for everybody with you all here. And of course, the man of the hour, if you will, is Yuri Gagarin, a test pilot of the highest order from the Soviet Union of that time. Just sort of the Soviet Union's version of the right stuff, definitely. And a very interesting fellow, chosen to be the first human to go to space, which that has got to be a bit of a weight on your shoulders when you're thinking about something like that. So the lead up to the Vostok 1 flight is basically the pinnacle of the space race itself. It's the reason why the space race was on, which was essentially to show that, well, in no plainer terms, my missile is bigger than your missile. That's essentially what the space race was. And there were some very interesting things that sort of peppered the space race in there that allowed the Soviet Union to have a little bit of an advantage over the United States. And that was that the Soviet Union, with their nuclear weapons that they developed, their nuclear weapons were much heavier than the weapons that had been designed by the United States. So that meant that the ballistic missiles that the Soviet Union had needed to be significantly more powerful than the ballistic missiles that the United States had. And that meant the Soviet Union, in terms of being able to throw stuff into space and actually have it, go around the Earth in orbit and not fall back down to the Earth, they actually really did have an advantage at that time, simply because of the fact that their nuclear weaponry was not as sophisticated as the United States. Theirs was heavier. The United States was very lightweight relative to what they had. So they had an advantage in terms of power. And if you look at the early rockets that were used to launch astronauts, they are essentially ballistic missiles, either theater ballistic or intercontinental, that have the warhead removed, and you just put a human where the warhead is. So the rocket that launched Yuri Gagarin is the R-7. Basically, the modern the lineage of ballistic missiles can go all the way back to then. Even the lineage of the Soyuz rockets that are still being used today can go all the way back to the Soviet era R-7 missiles. So absolutely fantastic series of rockets if you're still using them 60 years after. I mean, that's some pretty seriously good engineering. And Sergey Korolev, who was one of the lead engineers in the Soviet Union space program. Certainly an incredible force and someone still extremely highly respected across multiple countries and disciplines in rocketry today. So sticking Yuri Gagarin on top of a ballistic missile, this is how the Soviet Union was going to be sort of not just winning a propaganda victory, but showing off a technological victory as well. Sputnik had been a big one. We can obviously, if we can launch the satellite, we can hit anywhere we want in the Earth, is essentially what Sputnik was saying. And then this was, well, we launched the satellites. Now we decided to launch a person. So now we can really launch anything we want to hit anywhere on Earth. And Gagarin looked a little bit differently at the mission. He was pretty excited about it. And in fact, he was very relaxed on the day of, which, if you ask me, is a little interesting. You're going to be the first person to ever do something, and you're going to be quite relaxed with that there, as he was. And the weeks leading up to, or actually, excuse me, the years leading up to the Vostok 1 flight had been a series of tests to make sure that the Vostok spacecraft and associated systems would actually work correctly. And several weeks beforehand, they did fly an all-up Vostok spacecraft with the systems on board, including a dummy in there, and it had worked successfully, nearly flawlessly with what they had. So, in doing that, there was some confidence, cautious confidence, that the Vostok 1 mission was going to be a success for them. So, on April 12th, they woke up Yuri Gagarin and his backup, German Titov, and at 5:30 in the morning Moscow time, they were woken. They were given a nice breakfast. They were put in their spacesuits, and then they were transported to the launch pad. And you can see this great photo here of Yuri in front with German Titov in the back. German would end up flying on his own as well. But on the way to the launch pad, something happened, which is that the breakfast, the lovely breakfast that they had been given, I imagine Yuri was probably a little nervous, so I imagine that contributed to it too. But Yuri, he had to go to the bathroom. Specifically, he had to go pee. So what he ended up doing, he asked them to stop the bus. He got out of the bus and he went over to the tires on the back and he peed on the tires. And then he got back in and they took him down to the launch pad. But that has since become a tradition of cosmonauts launching out of Russia to pee on the tires of the bus. So if you're going to be flying out of Russia, they will have you stop at a certain point, go to the back tires of the bus, and then just let loose a little bit. And if you're a woman, then they allow you to carry a little vial back there, and you kind of, I guess, splash it on the tires with it. But it's considered good luck to go do that, because Yuri Gagarin did it for the Vostok 1 flight, and that's what ended up, allowing his flight to go on, and without too much of a hitch. And of course, I'm just kidding about that. There was so much work that went into it by the Soviet engineers of that time in order to make sure that that mission would go as flawlessly as they could possibly work with it. And there were some issues that they had with that mission. The first and foremost was that the hatch on Vostok 1, once they got Yuri Gagarin into the spacecraft right around 7 a.m. local time, they turned on the radio communication system and they started talking with Yuri, checking everything. They made sure that the onboard camera inside of Vostok 1 was working, because obviously, if you want to get that propaganda win, you've got to make sure that you show it off a little bit. And in addition to that, they were working with other things. There was about 2 hours of downtime from the work on it. So they were sort of getting the systems in Vostok 1 ready to go, and they closed up the hatch. They got it sealed up, and roughly about 40 minutes after Gagarin had entered the spacecraft, so about an hour and a half before launch, Gagarin noted that the hatch didn't look like it was sealed properly. So the technicians went back out. He checked out the hatch on Vostok 1, it hadn't been sealed properly. So they undid the hatch, they put it back on, resealed it, checked everything. It was good to go. And that took about an hour of extra time out of that. And while it was going on, um, there was some sort of rumors as to whether that actually happened or not. But there's some evidence that supports that it really was an actual issue with the hatch. Several people who were working as chief designers at that time were involved in putting the hatch back on. Oleg Ivonsky, who was the head designer of the Vostok spacecraft, said that he personally helped rebolt the hatch to put it back on. Take that as you will, I suppose, with a grain or a pound of salt, however much salt you want to throw on it. But that's what happened. During this time, Yuri Gagarin, still cool as a cucumber, he asked for some music to be played over the radio. Sergey Korolev, who was working with the program to develop these rockets, he was exceptionally nervous to the point that he was having chest pains in the blockhouse when it was going on. The success rate of Soviet rockets at this time was literally 50%. They launched 24 rockets, only 12 had succeeded. So obviously, you did not want anything to go wrong. And they actually ended up giving Korolev a pill to kind of chill him out a little bit. But Gagarin, on the other hand, cool as a cucumber. He was basically ready to go. They say about a half hour before launch, his pulse was nearly 60 beats per minute. So that's like me sleeping. So he was a pretty chill guy sitting on top of that there. So eventually the flight, eventually things were on through each stage of the rocket preparing to lift off. Korolev asked Gagarin if everything was okay, and then eventually got to launch time. Korolev said, "We wish you a good flight. Everything is all right." And Gagarin replied, "Let's go." And off it went at 6:07 Universal Time on April 12th, 1961. 2 minutes in, the two strap-on boosters on the side of the Vostok rocket there, they used up the last of their propellant and they separated from the core vehicle. Somewhere on the order of 40 seconds after that, the shroud that was covering Vostok 1 came off, which meant that the window that was at Gagarin's feet in the Vostok spacecraft was finally unobscured so you could take a look at it. 5 minutes after liftoff, the final core stage used up all of its propellant. So then the second stage of the rocket kicked in. About 60 seconds after that, Gagarin did his first major report, which is basically, I can see the Earth. Everything's looking good out there. And this is what I see. I can see some clouds and other things. Let's keep going. Everything is going good. And then finally, about a minute after that, Gagarin once again jumped in and said everything's good. And then another minute after that, started to run out of radio range. And they were letting him know Gagarin was basically radioing back to mission control. Everything was doing good. And then finally it shut down and he radioed back to mission control one more time. Everything's doing A-okay. Kept trying to talk to mission control, and basically Gagarin talked to himself throughout the entire mission as to what was going on, because the communications were not necessarily consistent, not like we have it nowadays, where we have a system that allows our spacecraft to be in constant communication with mission control. Back then, it was essentially ground stations and ships with ground stations on them with that. But eventually the mission was designed so that it would go into an orbit that would naturally decay after about a week. So something went wrong with the rocket that was supposed to fire to slow Vostok 1 down enough to come back after a single orbit. The altitude was low enough that Gagarin would be up there for about a week. That probably wouldn't be pleasant, but he did have about 2 weeks of provisions built into the Vostok 1 capsule, just in case. But about 80 minutes after liftoff, the retro rocket fired. There was a successful firing, and that fired for about a minute over the west coast of Africa. And they were about somewhere on the order of about 40, 4,000 miles range from Kazakhstan, where the landing was going to occur at. And the orbit did differ a little bit, but not much. It was a little higher than expected, but not much. And 10 seconds after retro rocket fire, the service module on the Vostok was designed to separate from the actual capsule itself. So in this view that I have right here, this is a view of the upper stage of the rocket. In the middle there is the service module. That would actually separate entirely from the upper stage, so we'd be flying solo. And then that spherical end at the top right there is actually where Gagarin was. And Yuri Gagarin inside of there was seated, and he just barely fit inside of there as well. So this was not a big spacecraft, truly spam in a can kind of status right here. And in addition to that, this is the instrument panel that Yuri Gagarin had to look at. That's not very complex compared to, like, say, what we have nowadays, or like what you would have seen in the shuttle, which we'll be talking about very shortly, or something nice and slick like you'd see in Crew Dragon nowadays with that there, or Starship whenever that ends up flying to the moon of all places with it. So holy moly, yeah, this really was not as complex as a lot of folks think it was. But and there's Yuri hanging out in the Vostok right there. But eventually, what happened, that service module did not separate. It unexpectedly remained attached by a bundle of wires. And when Vostok 1 began to re-enter, this started to send the vehicle out of control. And it was not the best for Yuri Gagarin inside of there. But eventually, those wires broke, and the two modules did separate. And the descent module finally got itself in the proper orientation and re-entry angle. Gagarin was basically saying throughout the entire time, everything's good, I'm good, and that he kept saying, you know, I'm good and everything. Gagarin later said that he knew something was up. he had pretty much guessed that the service module had come off a little bit, it hadn't gone off completely, but eventually he also correctly figured out that it probably wasn't too much of a danger because it was going to be able to handle that. But Gagarin did continue. He pulled about 8 Gs during reentry. So, you know, take that as you will. That doesn't sound particularly comfortable to me. But hey, you know, if that's the way it works, that's the way it works. So here's where we get a little bit of controversy about Yuri Gagarin and what happened on his flight, which is that at about 4 miles above the surface of the Earth, he pulled an ejection charge and he got fired out in an ejection seat. The main parachute did deploy from the Vostok 1 capsule, but it was not really well known as to whether the capsule would be a very good place to actually sit while it was landing. So Gagarin's parachute opened immediately as soon as he ejected at about 20,000 feet. It took him about 10 minutes to get down from there. But he and the spacecraft landed under parachute. And he actually landed very close to a farmer and her granddaughter at that time. What was so funny is that they were very concerned. They got very scared when Yuri started approaching them. And they started to run away from him. But eventually, you know, he took his helmet open and he said, you know, hey, I'm the Soviet citizen. You know, I just landed from space. I need to find a phone to call Moscow immediately. And that's what happened with Yuri's flight. So obviously, a absolutely amazing accomplishment, not just for considering what was going on at the time, or the fact that it was the Soviet Union who did it. It was just an amazing accomplishment, period, that with the technology of that time, a orbital flight was able to occur. There's controversy as to whether, you know, as to whether it counts or not as the first space flight, because Gagarin didn't land with the Vostok 1 capsule. I frankly feel like if he went into space and he eventually stayed with the spacecraft after going down below the altitude of space, that counts. Sounds good to me. So Yeah, it was fantastic. The United States congratulated the Soviet Union on doing this, and there were mixed feelings about this in the United States. Um, there might have been like celebrations, but there was also suspicions over this as well. And there was obviously a lot of fear over the fact that the Soviet Union just won another major propaganda victory. And it was 3 weeks before the United States finally launched its first American into space with Alan Shepard on Mercury Redstone. Uh, and we would not get an orbital flight until the next year with John Glenn on Mercury Atlas. So yeah, this was tough for for uh, for it, the United States at that time, but it was what it was, and it ended up motivating quite a lot for it. It was one of the moments that sort of sparked the idea of, okay, well, if we lost this part of the space race, what's a part of the space race we can win? And okay, well, let's give the moon a shot at that. And of course, we all know how that turned out. The United States is the first and so far only country to land humans on the moon. And for those of you watching who are not maybe not as spaceflight inclined as some of us, the official announcement for the human landing system for Artemis 1 occurred today, and SpaceX won that contract, sole source, all by themselves with SpaceX to do so. So it's on for the United States to return by 2024. But at this time in 1961, it wasn't necessarily, a idea of, is the United States going to be capable of getting to orbit? It was almost is the United States going to be capable of even coming close to matching what the Soviet Union can do? And there were doubters. There were people who thought that the United States was doomed because of Vostok 1. But really, that's not what ended up happening, as we all know from history. Things kind of turned out a little bit different from there. The Soviet space program did continue, obviously, even after the end of the push to get to the moon, with the Lunokhod program. But eventually, the Soviet Union basically ditched the idea of going to the moon and started to do space stations, which is actually where we get a lot of our experience today. But there's Yuri right there, heading on in to greet the proper people at the Soviet Union. He was a very soft-spoken man, definitely not interested in the spotlight. He just looked at it as basically I was doing a test flight. Very modest in the way he talked about it, very open in the way he talked about the flight too, or at least as open as he could be for the Soviet Union at that time. And the Soviet Union, he did go on a bit of a world tour. And as you can see, people were quite excited to see him. He did meet quite a lot of American astronauts, and there was really no animosity between them, because after all, if you're a part of a very exclusive club of launching yourself on several thousand tons of high explosives, I think you'd probably chuck animosity out the window at something like that. But unfortunately for Yuri Gagarin, this would be his only flight to space. He was viewed as such a win in the world of propaganda that they did not want to risk putting Yuri back into space again. So he was essentially grounded from doing space flights. He served as the backup crew for Soyuz-1, which ended up unfortunately killing the astronaut Vladimir Komarov when the parachute system failed on entry. One of a multitude of failures that happened during a mission that just should not have been flown with that. But they were very worried in the Soviet Union that their national hero, Yuri Gagarin, might get killed. So they did not allow him to do any further space flights. He was still allowed to fly regular aircraft, and he ended up, unfortunately, dying in a crash in a MiG-15 trainer jet in March of 1968. So he was not done in by a space flight, but he was done in by something that that many people in the field would probably have considered routine at it. There is a huge amount of debate as to what exactly were the details and the problems behind Gagarin's crash. But really, it's just all over the place that I didn't really want to touch it because there's stuff that borders on the line of conspiracy, and then there's things that border on the line of reality. But it's also very convoluted, and even historians don't have a sort of official idea as to which of these paths history actually took. So I thought it best to just basically say he died in a plane crash of a fighter jet while training in March of 1968. He was never going to go to space again, but they let him fly, and that's just the way the dice rolls sometimes. And to move on a little bit, because if we're talking about rolling the dice, boy, do we have something that is probably one of the biggest dice rolls in the history of spaceflight, a flight of a magnitude that just will never, ever be seen again. And that is the first flight of a space shuttle, the Space Shuttle Columbia, STS-1, originally scheduled to occur in 1979. This did not end up happening until April 12th, 1981. The shuttle is a complicated vehicle. It's a very complicated history with a very if you ask someone, was this a successful program or was this a failure of a program, you could answer with, it's complicated. There's no real, I feel, right or wrong answer to how you feel about the success or the failure of the space shuttle program. But ultimately, shuttle did do what it set out to do, which was to be a reusable vehicle to build a space station for the United States in orbit. That ended up becoming the International Space Station. We were originally going to build our own space station called Space Station Alpha, but once the fall of the Soviet Union and associated countries and other areas occurred, we very quickly realized that if the engineers in the former Soviet Union stopped working on the projects that the Soviet Union was working on, they'd go to places like Iran or North Korea, places that we tend to not want like proficient engineers at. So that was the thinking at that time period by folks who were in charge at there. So eventually, that's how we formed the International Space Station. We took that experience that Russia had developed during the Soviet era of flying space stations in the 70s and 80s and 90s with Mir, and continued on with that, and added that on to the International Space Station, which we now have today, which is a fantastic thing, which we have a plethora of astronauts at right now, and have a destination that's teaching us about how to live and work in space for very long periods of time, very similar to the periods of time it will take for us to get to Mars. So the shuttle did that. As to some other things that the space shuttle did, I will personally always argue that the space shuttle successfully showed how not to do a reusable vehicle. It definitely showed how to compromise on certain aspects, but it also showed what happens when you compromise too much with that. And shuttle was a very flawed vehicle, but it was a very beautiful vehicle. Did really accomplished a lot of what it set out to do. But the things that were bad with shuttle were really bad. Very expensive to maintain, unbelievably dangerous. Just you look at it now in hindsight and you just ask yourself, how did that happen? But ultimately, the lessons that were learned on shuttle are now benefiting people like SpaceX. SpaceX was able to look at shuttle and basically say what went wrong in terms of reusability and cost and reducing cost, and what can we do to avoid it, both with their Falcon 9 series of rockets and also with the upcoming Starship, including their lunar Starship, which is officially official as of, I guess, several hours ago in that announcement for the human landing system for Artemis. So congratulations, SpaceX, on winning that contract. Sole source, all by yourself. That's going to be pretty exciting. But shuttle was the exciting new kid on the block at this time. Oh man, it was the cool place. And where I'm sitting at right now here at the Columbia Memorial Space Center, we were part of the parking lot of the North American Rockwell and eventual Rockwell International, eventual Boeing site where the space shuttles were designed and built. So whenever you see a lovely photo of the shuttle like that, I always remind myself, designed and built in Downey. So pretty nice. It's a flex, but it is what it is. But Columbia also has a very interesting history with itself. That the finalized design of the space shuttle looks nothing like the first design of the space shuttle. There was constant compromises. The United States Air Force was basically working with NASA to try to develop the system. The United States Air Force wanted to use it to service spy satellites and other things like that by flying them out of Vandenberg Air Force Base here in California. And of course, we know how many space shuttles the Air Force bought after all those compromises. And with STS-1, you had a real sort of reinvigoration of the United States space program. You have to remember, we're coming off of Apollo at this point. We're wrapping up the Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975. And then we have a nearly 6-year gap of no crewed flights by the United States. So that was it. There was just nothing else going on in the United States flying to space at that time. So this was a big deal when this happened. And this is also a very big deal because of the two people that were flying it, which is the commander over on the left there, John Young, and the pilot on the right, Robert Crippen. If you want to talk about the right kind, you want to talk about the right stuff, that's the textbook definition of it right in front of you there. John Young was a astronaut's astronaut, is a good way to put it. He was, how do you, I'm trying to figure out a good way to describe it other than just he's the man. But that's basically what he was. He's the man. A absolutely incredible pilot, a great engineer, very humorous guy too, very good at keeping things relatively light with what they were working on and the seriousness of it there. There's a really great clip from the film Hail Columbia, and a great IMAX film if you ever want to watch the documentary about the first shuttle flight. Very good. We'll actually see a little bit of footage from it here. Don't tell the algorithm that we're showing that, but hey, what's so great about that great clip that I love is somebody, he's at a press conference and someone from the press says, "I don't understand, if you fire the ejection seats while the solids are still burning, I just don't understand how you're going to be able to do that." And John Young, just very straight-faced, stern, he just says, "Hey, you just pulled the little handle." So, and that's just the kind of guy John Young was. He was, again, a soft-spoken, very good engineer. And he did help develop the manual that basically is the Bible of how to fly and operate the shuttle, which if you'd like to get it, you can. There's 13 volumes, nearly 3,000 pages to it. So I expect a full report on that by my desk on Monday, students. Overall, just a fantastic astronaut. He'd already gone to space 4 times before this. He flew 2 Gemini missions, including Gemini 3, which is the first crewed flight of that. He flew on Apollo 10 as the command module pilot, and then Apollo 16 as the commander. So he is one of 3 people who have the distinction, a very honored distinction, of having been to the moon twice. So he was in orbit for Apollo 10, and then he walked on the moon for Apollo 16. And actually, right in the middle of one of his spacewalks on Apollo 16, or excuse me, moonwalks on Apollo 16, was when Congress approved the funding for the space shuttle officially in 1972. So he was actually walking on the moon when this vehicle that he was going to fly 9 years later was finally said, "Yes, go, start the program." So pretty amazing guy. Robert Crippen, a great test pilot, all around. He worked on what was called the Manned Orbital Laboratory, which was basically going to be a United States Air Force spy satellite launched from California that just so happened to have people on board. So that way they could, operate the optics and telescopes and other things that they were going to use to spy on whoever they were flying over. So, it was pretty obvious what it was for to everybody in the world. But eventually that program just got too big for its britches, ended up costing too much, didn't really make enough friends, I guess is how I would put it, amongst the budgetary areas. And that was it. 1969, that got canceled. But he eventually transferred over to NASA, which is where he became an astronaut, and then finally got to be the pilot of STS-1. The shuttle, unbelievably complicated vehicle. It is the most complex vehicle that humans have ever made, and it will likely be the most complex vehicle humans will ever make. There is simply no metric by which the shuttle does not blow anything else out of the water. Maybe the speed of the computers on board, but that's because they're not playing, the latest PS5 game on there. They're just crunching numbers and sending those numbers to different areas. So you don't really need a lot of computer power. But overall, the complexity of a vehicle to be done like this in the 1970s, which is still unbelievably impressive today. I feel like you could safely say, as an engineer myself, there will never be a vehicle this complicated ever again. Because this is just such everything you could possibly think of: material sciences, aerospace engineering, crew operations, food and other things, food development and other things. Shuttle just pushed it so far to the edge that there's no way to describe how big the impact Shuttle had on so many things, including things that are in our everyday lives that we don't really think about, like stents developed from the Shuttle program to keep fuel lines open. So not just that, but also, your arteries or wherever they're at in your body. So I could do that. Now, the day eventually came where launch was set to occur, April 10th, 1981. John Young and Robert Crippen had a nice breakfast. They got suited up in their ejection suits. You can see there, which are basically the same suits that SR-71 pilots would wear. They got into the Astro, they waved at everybody. Woo, here we go, we're going to launch. Got into the Astrovan, got into the shuttle, loaded up, sat down, we're ready to go. And then a computer didn't work. So, and Mission Control could not get the computer to work. So unfortunately, the first launch attempt of a space shuttle did not occur on time. It was scrubbed. So, hey, happens to the best of us, right? Hey, Crew Dragon? Yeah, it happens. So they eventually had to go back out there on April 12th. But on April 12th, as this clip from the amazing IMAX movie, Hail Columbia, is going to show you, on April 12th, 1981, everything looked good. And not just the fashion of everybody that was there at Kennedy Space Center at that time, but also the launch itself. It is one of those launches that you look at it and it is just absolutely gorgeous that they were able to catch the launch as nicely as they did with this. So take a gander. I always love this shot with the sound suppression system starting up, and then those 3 space shuttle main engines igniting. Here comes some birds, runaway birds, and then the solids light, and then there goes the shuttle, lifting off. Looking pretty good there. Of course, the shuttle used its 3 main engines, the RS-25, the Rocketdyne RS-25. I'm definitely with that guy. Yeah, go. That's pretty much me at rocket launches today. So the 3 RS-25s that you got going there, plus 2 of the largest solid rocket motors that have ever flown. And this is the first time as well that solid rocket motors were used on a launch with a crew. This was also the first time a crew had launched with their vehicle for the first launch ever. usually you want to do a test flight with nobody on board, right? Usually, but not the shuttle. No, shuttle's different. They went ahead and they did a test flight with the people aboard. Oh my goodness. Oh, that's frightening to think about nowadays, but I suppose back then that's just how they looked at it. And very interestingly, NASA originally did not want to do this full orbital flight as the first flight for Columbia. What they actually wanted to do was called an RTLS, return to launch site abort. They basically wanted to go up with the shuttle, reach this point where the solid rocket boosters separate, turn the shuttle around, fire the engines until enough fuel has been depleted that the shuttle is now heading back to Kennedy, and eventually ditch the fuel tank and then land back at Kennedy. They wanted to do that. And John Young very flatly looked at the mission planners and he said, let's not play Russian roulette. So, um, so I can't help but agree with that sentiment there with it. So there's the external tank separating. Those external tanks were painted white until STS-3, which is where they finally moved on to the orange color that you and I are familiar with to save 600 pounds of weight, which sounds silly, but every ounce counts in spaceflight, so that's the way it goes. It's a beautiful launch. There were problems, though, but we'll get to that in just a second, because I want to show you some of this amazing footage that we were able to find with that there. Actually, I'm sorry, we got a little messed up there. So beautiful shot of external tank separation there with the white tank with the paint on there. You definitely get a feeling for where the heat builds up throughout the flight. You can see a beautiful, let me see if I can get my cursor there. Of course not. But you can see those beautiful char marks on about somewhere on the order of, I'd say about, what, 3/4 of the way down to the top. The beautiful char marks from the SRB separation. So, yeah, fantastic. Just beautiful. Now, one of the biggest concerns of Shuttle was that the tiles would come off during launch. And they were really worried about something called zippering, where they thought one tile would come off and then it would pull a whole line of tiles behind it off as well, which would then pull even more tiles off with it. So NASA and the National Reconnaissance Office, which is what this is just the government group that operates the United States spy satellites, they actually coordinated together without letting anybody know to take images of Columbia on orbit. Probably one of the most complex operations they had done. A similar operation was attempted during the unfortunate final flight of Columbia, STS-107, but it was overruled by NASA. NASA management at that time did so. So there was a point where they actually had the shuttle maneuver to get imagery from those spy satellites. They did not tell Crippen or Young about that. They just said, we need you to maneuver the shuttle for us there. Still don't know today what time exactly that occurred at, but we know it occurred for sure because NASA just basically wanted to hedge their bets to make sure everything was okay there. Some tiles came off. It was basically viewed as areas that were not too particularly important, but you know, it was still something to look at as well. And here they are on orbit. John Young sitting in the commander's seat there, and there they are hanging out on the flight deck with the seats stowed away. And this is the mid deck of the shuttle that they got right there. So with the airlock over by John Young in that area, 400,000 people showed up at Edwards Air Force Base to watch the shuttle land for the first time. And boy, is it coming in hot. 10,000 feet per second glide slope. Holy moly. And coming in, pulling out very, very nicely of that there. Nice, gentle landing. Coming down on that smooth lake bed at Rogers Dry Lake out there at Edwards Air Force Base. Very interesting place. And just gently coming down, ever so slightly. And there you go, touchdown. Just that easy. Piece of cake, right? So I could do it in my sleep. So, yeah, pretty amazing that they were able to accomplish that in 1981. So fantastic. I just saw, since the producer's computer is about 20 or so seconds behind, I saw the moment of shuttle coming down, at that really steep angle, 10,000 feet per second. And I just now noticed that the T-38 Talon chase aircraft, they had their gear deployed to generate enough drag so that they didn't overtake the shuttle. So you're wondering how bad the aerodynamics of the shuttle are. There you go. There's John Young coming down. Looks like he's had a good time. There's Robert Crippen after John Young. He's also had a good time too. So beautiful California morning like we have out here, and just overall a really great time was had by everybody. And shuttle program continued for another 30 years with 135 flights after that. So Columbia popping that wheelie right there. Beautiful shot on the lake bed out of Edwards, and another great shot down in Mission Control, kind of showing everybody taking a look there as Columbia rolled out. Yeah, it was a fantastic mission. There were some things that were a bit sketchy on that mission, though, not just those tiles, but we're also talking about things like when the SRBs started up, the pressure wave that came off of the SRBs actually nearly broke the body flap of Columbia. If we go back, I'll go back into this really quickly here, try to see. Unfortunately, it's obscured in the image, so I can't show it to you directly. But there's a body flap underneath where the engines are at, and the space shuttles would use that to sort of work with their pitch, so up and down motion, and use that to work with that. That was nearly broken, and if that had broken, that would not have allowed the vehicle to actually have performed a successful reentry. So that would have been game over for Columbia right out of the first one. John Young said that if he had known just how bad that pressure wave had been during launch, he would have ejected. So if you can imagine, within minutes of the first launch of your vehicle, you've already ditched it into the ocean and just basically given up on your first one. I don't know if the shuttle program would have survived something like that, but it certainly would have given a weird alternate history compared to what we have now with shuttle. In addition to that, some of the reaction control system thrusters were firing at lower altitudes than expected, low enough that they could have caused an explosion in the areas that they were firing from. So that was not exactly very, very good. And also some other things, they're flying sort of a middle of the road reentry there and managing the energy and other things like that. And overall, it was a successful mission, but it was also had those moments that very well could have doomed the mission as well if things had not gone just a little bit better. So if things had gone just a little bit worse, then unfortunately, I don't think we'd be talking about STS-1 as excitedly as we do today. So that is sort of our little review that we have of Vostok 1 and STS-1. So hopefully you enjoyed that. It's a very quick rundown on them, both very complicated missions with that there. For our next Space Center Live, we are going to be having that sometime in mid to late May. Don't have an official date yet, but we do know what we're going to be talking about, which is the history of the Commercial Crew Program. So coming up on the first anniversary of the first flight of a crewed commercial crew vehicle with SpaceX Demonstration Mission 2, which launched Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken last May. We're going to go ahead and talk about the Commercial Crew Program and the history of it, because it is an absolutely fascinating history that goes into that, significantly more complicated than you probably expect it to be. And it's a very exciting program, and I'm very excited to be talking about that because it's a program that not a lot of people know too much about. And you see the results of it now with SpaceX flying their Crew Dragon and Boeing getting gearing up to get their Starliner in order to make that happen. But it's a very long program. Many people don't know it actually starts back in the early aughts. But we'll get into that and talk about that a little bit. So Commercial Crew, very exciting, especially with the selection, just of today, with SpaceX getting the human landing system for Artemis, single source on that contract. That's got to feel pretty good for all of them down in Hawthorne, I got to say. So congrats to SpaceX on that. And we'll see you all next month. Stay tuned to all of our social media channels and areas on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And you'll find out pretty soon when that's going to be. So thank you all for tuning in to watch this edition of Space Center Live, and keep exploring.